Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they are played. I am your host, Max, and joining me, of course, is my co-host, Troy. Working behind the scenes, as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is a focusing in on something that we've talked in previous episodes, but really trying to get the kernel of the idea, and I don't think we really explored it fully, which is the idea of turns and timing, and in some ways the terminology therein, and how that is measured.
Yeah.
This is really what gives a sense of like the hard time and place when things in your game seem to happen and how long it actually takes.
Like what does a beat mean in your world, you know, whether it's like an encounter of like a sword fight or a conversation or like the travel distance between two locations.
Sure. Or the moment to moment breakdown of how time is separated. Like how slowed down does the action get in some sense?
Yeah. Like how fine is the increment, right?
Yeah. So from our last episode, we were very much exposed to this idea of, which was the Starfleet Battles episode, of the idea of impulses, which is broken down quite extensively, down to, in the full game, 32 sub-phases called impulses for every turn of larger decision-making.
That's kind of wild. It's a little overwhelming, but it gives a lot of texture.
Yeah, for sure. But like this concept is present in all sorts of role-playing games. I can think of Boot Hill, at least the third edition of it. But it's probably present in the earlier editions. Had it that each turn is a second, and each second is broken down into 6 sub parts. This only applies to the shootout phase, which I imagine is being like the spaghetti western slow motion style. In the cases of ambushes and other things like that, I believe it just works on a normal initiative system. The highest goes first and so on.
Okay.
It's surprisingly granular, broken into 6. Another example of this that gets more granular than that at least is a role-playing game, is the Sasquatch Games edition of Alternity. Breaks everything down into, I think a round is 15 seconds, and it's broken down into 2-second impulses.
Oh.
Which some actions will extend across others. Like, I'm trying to think about like how this feels. It makes it feel more like a tactical game. I'll give you that. Yeah, it's a lot to think about. Like, oh, well, I'm going to run from here to there, and that'll take 3 impulses. And then that guy will aim and shoot, and that will take 2. And in some sense, the impulses in Alternity create a version of overlapping simultaneous action.
I must say that in my experience, I like the RuneQuest style of ticks on a clock face.
Well, that's like this in a lot of ways. They even have demonstrated with a circle divided into 8 slices.
See, okay, if that is, then if I'm understanding you correctly, that way in which my action adds up to the moment I take my slice, so to speak.
Or multiple slices, depending on what you're doing.
Okay.
So running a certain distance really determines how many of those slices you use up.
That's interesting. And I like that because there's a time and place for like chunk movement, right? Where it's like, I do all my movement and it's resolved. Or we do all of our movement and then we're all resolved. Like there's absolutely cause for that. But in a game where you're dealing with the results of individuals, I do like the granularity of the sequential activations based on the things they are literally choosing to do. You know, in like a role-playing game, you have the flexibility to explore stuff like that. That in like a war game, it'd be like, oh, that'd be a mess.
Yeah. Though I think as we've seen, at least in a game that uses very few parts, or at least uses a much more granular base of movement, like a hex map, it is possible to do that. But you're right, it is more bookkeeping if you're using a lot of different units.
It really is about managing your scale and scope that you bring to the table. And I think that works really well if you are upfront about it and also pick a setting where that makes sense. Like in Star Trek, we see oftentimes individual ships dueling with each other, or we see small parties of ships, it's not really that you're seeing these concentrated fleet actions very often. So a game like Starfleet Battles, playing with small numbers of ships, is perfectly on the nose, because that's based on our experience through the medium of the fiction, right? Like, that's what we see.
Yeah, it's representative in the example that it's given. Whereas something like Star Wars does have large ship actions, but it also has a lot of smaller ship actions. And maybe you could use something to then divide up those larger turns so that those large ships have to act on the larger turns and the smaller ships can act between them.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I love that.
So that's an interesting thought process. I don't know. I haven't seen that necessarily represented in a game, but maybe there is something out there.
I've seen like 40K games where there was a Battlefleet Gothic game that every 6 turns a Battlefleet Gothic game was played, and then everyone would play a 40K game, you know? And then there'd be another Battlefleet, then you'd do the next turn. And that was very like local storefront kind of campaign system. But it was a novel idea.
Yeah, so the thing, though, is that those are happening on 2 different fronts.
That's true. That's very true. They are different tables.
I don't know that I would... I mean, I'm not saying that delegitimizes the idea of timing, because obviously we're talking about it. So we could talk about simultaneous gaps of time. I think Battletech could work this way, because you would have the strategic operations, and then you could have the actual like game playing out, and maybe every so many turns of that, if the fight lasts that long, then a larger turn with these fleet actions. So you could have it so that like, oh, we have to hold the fort until our reinforcement fleet, and then that's actually represented timed differently because the time scale zooms out.
That'd be great. I would love that.
It would take some planning, obviously. Yeah, it could be really rewarding.
That's where GMs or umpires become much more relevant, is coordinating that kind of stuff. Because a lot of times there's like a degree of, I don't want to call it interpretation per se, but I mean, I guess it's all interpretation. But I mean to say, like, there's a degree of reasoning that goes into some of the Battletech integrations of different levels of campaign play. You know what I mean? So it's almost like it'd be really valuable to have an umpire who could like help govern the interactions between these opposing forces, and not like handle the timing entirely, but help like adjudicate some of the more finer points of, you hit system, what choices do you make? You're defending, you're aware they are here. What choices do you make? I will mesh them. Almost in like that Kriegspiel way.
Kriegspiel is an interesting one because it, depending on whether you're playing traditional or rules-based or free Krieg kind of style, time can expand or collapse as needed. And that's sort of true of a lot of games, like role-playing games nowadays. And I feel defaultively a lot of, like, I find the idea of a tactical timing system, I wouldn't say it's anathema to role-playing, but certainly people gravitate away from it in that sense. Then again, some people really love it. The BECME version of D&D actually has sequential phases, which was interesting because I didn't realize that it had this. I don't know if everybody used it, but there was this idea that like certain things would act before certain other things.
Yeah, right, of course.
So I think ready to range weapons would fire before movement, and then after movement, melee weapons would activate. And there'd be a number of other things. I think spells had a certain point. I guess it's sort of the similar idea to the idea of how do you play with space? Like, is space an abstraction? You know, is this is sort of the idea of movement? And is that concept of abstraction, does it hinder the imagining of play, or does it kind of help direct it in a certain way? Like, are you counting every 5-foot square, or is there forced movement? And if you don't have a measure of space in your game, then what does forced movement do?
Yeah.
So forced movement, for those that don't understand, is the idea of like, I move you back a square or 2 or whatever. And there are abstracted versions of that where like, oh, well, I send you flying. So now you could take it in terms of keywords like, we are no longer engaged in combat and you are now prone. So it removes this qualifier and adds this qualifier. There's the idea of time being a representation of that kind of, how closely do you want to measure it, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of even doing that? Like, I don't know. How do you feel? I think I was more on the abstracted. It's weird. I think I've gone from fixed space and abstracted time to the reverse.
Okay.
But I'm still muddling through the time aspect. I think it really depends on the game. The thing that won me over was the Call of Cthulhu rule. I think it's 7th edition that included this, that if anybody is holding a loaded and ready gun, they skip initiative effectively, or gain such a bonus as they effectively skip initiative. Because if you think about it, if I was holding a pistol and I was ready to use it, it would just take pulling my finger. So it's like, what amount of effort?
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
I also have a similar criticism about how bows work. I may have mentioned this in another episode, that firing a bow is not like pulling the trigger on a crossbow. And so it requires you to pull back and fire. And in my house game, I actually say that without really high level of training, you essentially have to sacrifice your movement in order to shoot a bow. But the convenience is that it doesn't require reloading.
It makes bows more of a targeted use item, but also when you consider their range and some of the advantages of using them, it's like a trade-off, and it feels like there's an economy there that makes sense.
I also like the idea that it's not just better. This is the same thing that I have about weapons operating in a more tactical fashion rather than some weapons just simply being better than others. Like, how is a rifle better than a pistol? Well, it's not really about that. It's how does this thing get used in a situation that's different from this? I can react faster and much closer up with a pistol than I can with a rifle. Because to fire a rifle, you have to turn your entire body quite dramatically in order to reposition, unless they're far away, in which case you don't. And the pistol has the advantage of just being able to turn, if maybe awkwardly, to, point one hand at somebody and then hit them. But then at range, it doesn't have the barrel length or the power to necessarily reach the target. So it's this sort of idea of trade-offs. And I think timing in a game really gets into that. But I think I've noticed it more prevalent in war games because of the limited theater of experience that's happening. I guess you could cordon off the fact that combat in a role-playing game could be treated like a war game if you don't mind the shift being from this to that. Almost like it playing like its own game within the broader role-playing experience, which I think is more or less how it was played back in the day.
With chainmail, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but even with other role-playing games, if not in practice, then at least in principle. It's like when someone said roll initiative, and we still have this echo, it means that time and actions are now going to operate in its own little container. But I find that more recent game design, obviously not like indie game design, which might be exploring this, but mainstream game design tends to see that boundary between pre-initiative play and post-initiative play as being a little bit more porous.
Okay, so, yeah, what do you mean? Help me get on the same page.
Aside from knowing who goes in what order, there isn't necessarily this idea of what happens before what, except, of course, maybe in the Call of Cthulhu example or in RuneQuest example, where certain actions may cover certain amounts of time or require a different amount of effort, whether that's abstracted or specifically counted.
Right.
I find something like 5th edition D&D, unless you know something other, or even 3rd to 5th edition D&D is, well, maybe 4th might have some more tactical, but it's more space tactical than time tactical.
It for sure is.
Some things take more turns to activate or may activate for multiple turns, but it's really not tied to the idea of certain things happening at certain times. It's just, okay, it's your activation. What do you do? And this is really not that much of an interruption from, oh, we were just wandering around and saying stuff. We're just now saying stuff in a particular order.
Yes, it's truly not that different.
Not as much in how, say, BECME or AD&D or even other games, not even those. As I said, there are investigative games that might treat combat. And I think for games where combat is really crucial, it might mean more in that case, because you need to have a better balance of decision making, or you're kind of hooped. Because if it's a game where you can only take one hit,
yes,
or at the very least, one hit would be extremely debilitating, being able to make careful decisions about how that actually works is way more important than in a game where you have double-digit hit points and your weapons only do single-digit, or, if you're playing really high level, those things might balance out, but there's that idea of upward escalation that something like clock facing your combat sequence doesn't really mean the same thing. It's not that it wouldn't be fun or interesting. It's just not as important, I feel. And, you can be as abstract as just saying, if you meet these requirements, you jump the queue. But it could be as strict as, okay, all of the range weapons, like old Warhammer battles had strict directions of things happening, not necessarily simultaneously, but in a particular order. Like the spell is selected, but it doesn't fire until the end.
Or great weapons go last in combat, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So that it's more of that categorized, but it does fall into that phasing. So that and it's the difference between a global or local rule.
Right. Yeah.
I find older games tend to go with that global ruling, right? Everybody must go through phase 1, then phase 2, then phase 3, then the order ends and we start again. Whereas the Call of Cthulhu example generally feels more of like a localized rule. So this, normally we would go through initiative like this, but this rule then trumps that normal sequence of play.
Yeah, it supersedes that. I get you.
It's a pretty subtle difference between those two, but it's essentially, are you playing by way of procedure, or are you playing through these sort of causal interactions? Because I have, say, a talent that allows me to skip the line.
And I really prefer that style where the action choice is going to manifest in a different turn order. I love that.
So you would prefer the looser style for a role-playing game?
Well, for a role-playing game, I what I'm trying to say is I had so much fun in some of my RuneQuest fights. Just a one-on-one fight felt like a whole tactical exhibition because of the timing, thinking of when to throw my javelin, draw my sword, raise my shield, take the blow. That sequencing was so rewarding. And again, I feel like games that have smaller unit counts, especially role-playing games, can embrace that and really drive that for you in a way that's hard to do in a bigger scale war game where you're dealing with more of these grander phases. You know what I mean? These broader activation sequences.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a finer distinction, because the RuneQuest system is more like a commitment to certain phasing, right? Like, I'm going to do this, but it's either going to take this long, which by other decisions may change what other people do, or it will commit me to a certain level of recovery once I've actually succeeded. So it's almost a wagering system.
Yeah, it is.
But it does follow a sequence of time, which is really, really unique and interesting. And yeah, I think I tend to like that. And because it's a Chaosium BRP rule, you could port it into pretty well anything. I could see a fencing duel in Call of Cthulhu, which would be a really fun set piece, to work on that principle.
No, that'd be so cool.
Maybe we should turn our attention to how this works in war games and strategy games.
Well, there's different ways to think about the events on the table. Are they representative of a swirling simultaneous event? Or is it something that can be sequentially broken down into tiers and steps? And different games will effectively attempt to simulate that differently. To point to our friends at Nordic Weasel Games, they have something called absolute timing. And that's a concept that means nothing happens at the same time. Everything is in a sequence of events, one following another. And if you're ever confused about what to do, just take the most logical string of events and apply it in one step at a time logic. And that's the way that you break down a complicated event to a simple event. And there's no overlap. There's nothing simultaneous. It is, I do all of my movement. Then, if you wanted to, you could interrupt me. But you can't interrupt me when I'm doing a thing because there's nothing simultaneous, right? It's always these different steps. So it's a very helpful way of breaking things down, especially I find for solo gaming where you can have lots of abilities that are not really like, again, the dreaded word balance, but they're not really like balanced in the sense of having like a clean, like, no, this, you cannot have this ability if you have this ability because the overlap is messy. You know, it's like in a solo game, you might acquire characters who have all types of abilities, and sometimes there can be weird overlaps in what one character in your party can do with another, or even with them their own set of abilities. So by thinking of it with this progressive pattern, you can really unlock a complicated breakdown of things. Another way to do it, of course, is to see everything is happening at once and apply the results of all the simulated actions, not one after another or in an order, but all together. So you would figure out all of the shooting, and then no one's hit until we're all hit. And at the end of the shooting phase, apply it.
So similar to what I was talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting with the idea of like interruption, because like Chain does that.
Yeah, big interrupt is in Chain.
You can activate an interruption in order to carry out a particular kind of move.
And in Chain 2, there are reactions now. So you can react to movement with the spending of pips on your chain of command die, or instead you have the opportunity to spend a full die to just whole hog get in the way of your opponent's turn and do something crazy, So that's really fun. But it's also a really interesting distinction because it means there's sort of like two ways that you can play with the flow of time using a chain of command die. One of them is reactive and one of them is active. And it's sort of dependent on how much tactical awareness have you so far clocked or generated in your die points. You're like, okay, I have enough awareness of the situation. I have the positional perspective on my opposition. I know my own forces. I know where we're at. I know where my support is. Let's go. And having the chain of command die represents your ability to influence time based on your intuition and knowledge in the moment. And that's like a really cool concept.
Well, and it's sort of I think what simultaneous movement does is it's an attempt to eliminate that decision making by having things carry off no matter what's going to happen. So like the Battletech example is we both shoot, and even though you blew my arm off, my shot actually still hit, and it paints a slightly different picture in your head. So the idea is that like as my arm is being blown off, the weapon fires and then hits you in like the chest or whatever.
Yes, exactly. Very dramatically.
And that's also actually going to the Boot Hill example. That is possible to do in that game as well, especially it's considerably a fatal game. So like you can have it so that two people kill each other very easily.
Yes. And I got to say, I have a place for that in my heart when it comes to wargaming because, don't get shot.
Yeah. And I think it's also sort of the idea that I think also gets, this is a total side thing, but it's something that you see, and I partly blame movies and video games because it would be both challenging to do and perhaps too horrific and real, is that when you shoot somebody, they don't just fall over dead. Usually, like it's quite rare that somebody would just die instantly. Very often there's a lot of ugliness.
It's not like a black and white cowboy film where they just fall over clutching their chest.
Yeah.
No, there's a lot of shouting and other nonsense that's quite unfortunate.
And also an ability to retaliate even in the throes of death, which is also not an uncommon thing.
Yeah, that's true. There's a certain morbidity to that is sort of avoided in many games, which I don't know there's a mistake. But no, I know what you mean, though.
Well, and I think tabletop, because it exists in, there's this idea that you can get away with more horrible things in a literary space because you're not exposing anyone to the shock value of it. It's more of the perceptive value.
Oh, okay, yes.
Role-playing games kind of fit that. So having the idea that those phenomena exist, that got like, I think this is the idea about negative hit points, is this person is incapacitated, but through some circumstances, they might still act at the point where they hit 0.
I'm freaking dying over here. Yeah, exactly. I'm picturing Tim Roth now.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the idea of simultaneous time allows for those moments where, we both shoot and we both hit. Or maybe that narrow moment where it's like, oh, you almost hit and like zoom past my head or whatever. Also, the sequence of play in a game can lead to some interesting outcomes where you can see very closely if you play the sequences exactly as, you'll determine things like near misses with much more detail, as opposed to, oh, you missed, ignored, right?
Yeah.
We'll just make it up. You can't just make it up as much when you have a tightly sequenced game. You will actually know. It just takes longer.
Now, this is something wargames do a fair bit. They'll have simultaneous combat, but sequenced movement and shooting. So you'll conduct a movement phase, a shooting phase, and then a shared combat phase of simultaneous action. And that's interesting, but what is that actually representative of in terms of the movement of the troops on the battlefield? It's a contrivance to allow the game to play, but I don't think that it actually meaningfully represents anything happening on the battlefield or any command decision, because it's just like, these guys go, but while that's all happening, these guys are still going. And it creates this weird, like, different flows of time on the same table, which I don't mind in the way that, like, Dux Britanniarum, the Lardy's Dark Age game, medieval game, handles it, in the way that, like, anytime we draw a card that's the draw a card that activates type of turn order, right? Anytime we draw a card for somebody or something in that fight, that whole fight goes. The whole fight just spins off again. And I love that because it keeps the fights deadly and engaging, but they're only happening at these relevant moments. It's not like I do a couple administrative moves on my turn just to reorder my battle line, and then the whole war happens, and then you do a couple administrative moves, and then the whole war happens again. It's kind of like this more dynamic sequence of organic things, and that's why I like a card-driven game.
Yeah, cards are interesting because they allow you to, well, it depends on how they're being used. If they're just being turned over for sequence and you're just following that order, then it's essentially dice that don't change and always have a definite order. If it's something where you're deciding when and how to play such a thing, like, I guess in some ways, certain things in Deadlands are like activated by those.
Oh, okay. Yes.
You get a different structure to that. Again, we're talking about like really subtle, like it's more like how it feels and what it represents. It does come down to a definite amount of decision making, but it's more about how you represent that. And, like there's a tactical way to take that in. And it's really interesting. So like when we were playing Starfleet battles, I knew that at any point I was in range, and that's quite a distance.
Yeah.
You could choose to attack me at any point. And I could choose to attack you, and they both would inflict damage at anywhere in that sequence. But there was still this tension as to like, do I shoot when you shoot? Because that won't really change anything. Or do I wait? Do I take the shot and continue to go through in order to get a better shot? I think the ultimate timing game is the game of chicken.
Yeah, it was a game of chicken in a sense, isn't it? Yeah, I see what you mean.
The ebb and flow of that idea between games. We've gone on record as saying that probably the worst initiative system is you go, I go.
Yeah, just like I do it all, you do it all,
Unadulterated, right? Like at least with, say, bolt action, you have like individual activations that are semi-randomized randomized by side.
Yeah, exactly. Or like in a game like Pillage or Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, you have different priority in the turn as you go through these phases where we alternate phase, so that still has a lot of texture.
You need to have something slightly more interesting, and I think that good game designers kind of recognize that, because I really do think that timing in a strategy game is a really important aspect. because it shapes how I think about the game and it changes what I think I'll be able to do at any particular point.
So do you need to know how long a turn represents in quote, real time to help visualize those decisions? Like if I tell you a turn is 1 minute, does that help you understand your decisions for that turn?
I find with the relation to actual time, it's nice to know, not a need to know.
Okay.
It helps more with the storytelling of a sequence. I find that the more like the order in which things happen or might happen, if in the case of like interruption or reaction, how those come together play more in my decision making. It's like knowing the exact amount of distance that a thing represents.
Right.
Like an inch equaling 5 yards, say in chain of command, doesn't mean anything because I'm just looking at the inches and the proximity between these models and those models.
Yeah. So in that regard, you don't need to know that it's 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But when you're thinking about perhaps after the fact or in the sense of a narrative, having those timestamps can be really valuable.
I think the interest, and this may be more of an affective role-playing games than, say, war games, though it's true of war games. If you break down the actual time in sequences to how long something takes in a role-playing game, and this can be from anywhere from the minutes to seconds scale of a battle to the minutes to hours to days scale of exploration and like overland travel.
Yeah.
When you add it all up, you realize that like sometimes a lot of things happen in a really short period of time. And then when you travel, the reverse sort of happens. You're like, oh, wow, we've been playing the game in world for like a week.
Yeah, you're so right.
It literally was only a handful of dice rolls for encounters, and then we were out the other side. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind when it comes to time is that it's very easy to truncate in a simulation. And sometimes that's to the advantage. Like, for instance, Legend of the Five Rings, certainly the Fantasy Flight version of it, you can abstract away, like an example being like, you can have a banquet that uses social interactive turns, and you might play out the interplay between these things. But as far as like time, it may be broken into 3 rounds, and it might just be like, oh, here's the opening presentation, and, you know, my character is playing, you know, introducing them by playing a beautiful song, or maybe I'll save that toward the end or a midpoint, or I'll give a bunch of formal introductions based on etiquette. And all of these things are happening simultaneously in a big chunk that represents a really vague amount of time.
Yeah, totally. That's really true.
It's more of that scene to scene. Actually, the way that I play a World of Darkness game, or most White Wolf games, is also more in that abstracted thing, where it's definitely taking up time, but that time bleeds into other, and it's more event-driven. Like, oh, this thing sets up this thing, and then that thing sets this off. And then you don't calculate, you just sort of decide roughly how long that was. The thing I'm always trying to get used to, especially because my D&D game is at present very calculated. I'm trying to be very fastidious to timekeeping. The dreaded panic moment is, so what time of day is it?
I love that question as a GM.
In a looser game, I might just decide it's this. But in a game where it's tight, I'm like, oh, I actually should know this. So I can go through, and I have like a turn tracking sheet where it's like, oh, rounds, turns, days, or like, what did I break it into? Yeah, quarters of a day.
Right.
And they all kind of filter into each other, so I can quickly add them up and be like, oh, okay, well, it's about this long. But there's that moment where I'm like, oh, right, I do have to kind of know that.
Yeah, that's on me, guys.
Like, I don't think you guys would care if I got it right or not, but it matters to me in order to uphold the soundness of the world.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. As the GM, it helps you keep your context.
Yeah. So that's an interesting exercise. But then, as I said, in a game that's more narrative and event-driven, so that's the narrative equivalent of time is an event-driven time scale.
Yes.
And it leans more into the idea that certain things will happen when it's cool. Like maybe because you both succeed, you do hit at the same time. Or maybe it means that one person counteracts the other person and then they don't act.
Or, yeah, right. Like, or opposed rolls where someone rolls of a certain degree net worse than the other, right?
Yeah, I find that systems that calculate the quality of a roll rather than a pass-fail are way more important in those narrative systems because of that exact reason. Because it gives you a decision point that makes it so that, oh, I just canceled your move. Bam, you got shot.
Yeah.
Whereas, oh, you scored about as well as I did, so we both hit each other. That's effectively the compensation when you're going with a beat-driven game. But that points to the fact that I feel there needs to be a system to govern that principle so that the whole reason we track time and all this is because interesting things happen when we do that are more surprising than if we were to just fiat decide. Also, here's a good question for you.
Hit me.
What is a turn? And how does it relate to other terminology like a phase and a round?
Okay. So a phase is a distinction of a turn is a distinction of a round, and a round is when all players have done their thing. So like a turn is one player, a round is all players, and a phase is one player doing part of their overall turn. That's how I've always looked at it, but not every game adheres to that, and they kind of have their own lexicon.
Well, it's a linguistic thing. I always find round always means the same thing because it's in the name. It comes from traditional gaming.
Yes, that's right.
From like card games and board games. Is, a round is when we've all gone around the table.
Yeah.
It has a simple linguistic grounding to it. A turn, that can be interchanged as either what I do in a round, or it can be something that supersedes the round itself for some other event. And then sometimes that's the role of a phase. Phases are I always find a phase is a subset of something else.
Yes, that makes the most sense.
It's partly baked into the word. So, again, with BECMI, there's like the bow firing phase, or the range weapon firing phase. And then there's the movement phase. And then there's the melee attack phase. And those are breaking down, in this case, what happens to everyone in a round based on what they've established themselves to do in their initiative. Because the first part of the phase is a declaration of action.
Yes, I don't mind that. I think that's actually fun.
It takes a little bit of a different point of thought because you go around and decide everything. But I as I said, I think I'm moving more into that strict timing idea because yes, there's the Call of Cthulhu example I gave. The other one was when I learned about, standoff initiative as opposed to ambush initiative.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we mentioned this in our initiative episode, but ambush initiative is usually what we would think of as standard initiative. So everybody rolls and the person with the highest score goes first. Standoff initiative is a weird variation on this where everybody rolls and the person with the lowest roll goes first, but acts last. And this is basically a way for every player to, it forces every person after the first person in initiative to telegraph what they're doing. So that when the top of the order makes their action, they are all enacted in the reverse order. So I go for my gun, but I'm lower in the initiative. Now the guy knows I'm going to go for my gun because they haven't decided, and then they'll act first too. There is an interesting thing that does because it deals with the idea of future knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you could try to hope that they miss, but you know that they're going to hit first, or in some games, it's simultaneous. So we declare our actions in a particular order, but then they enact at the same time. And it's more about knowing what everyone is doing in order to make a more tactical decision.
And that's more like a BattleTech or a Wild West shooter, right?
Yeah, I think it's a hallmark of skirmish games that declaring first is not a good thing. Whereas in something like D&D, getting first initiative means that you don't get hit first, or you get to hit first.
Yes, exactly. You get to deliver it before they themselves do. Mm-hmm.
I think that's really the difference. If we're making a distinction, after that distinction, how does the rest of the thing pay off? So I agree with you. I think that to me, the gold standard is the RuneQuest method because it is both sequentially locked, but at the same time, well, if you know the game well, you fully understand what you're committing to.
And there's a rewarding sense of decision that comes through that, like if you're getting better at the game, it's both because you're learning how to make decisions and your character's getting more powerful. But you're learning like, no, I'm actually better at duels. It's foolish to run in like this. And like your friend might be like, I'm going to charge ahead and get skewered by a spear. And you're like, haha, I myself have done this before. You know what I mean? Like there's a certain rewarding player knowledge that comes from a timing and initiative sequence that requires decision moments, as opposed to just a binary, I'm going good now, guys. Wait for me to do my thing, and then you can go.
It's always what you're playing.
Yeah. Do you find that like sci-fi and fantasy should just have inherently different like initiative systems, like thinking the difference between a melee to a ballistic system? Or do you think that inherently it's the same problem, so you should have the same solution?
I think that's more of an action economy problem than a timing problem.
Right.
I think you can treat things with the same kind of timing perspective, that these things happen before these things, or if you're using an initiative system that advances action, then these things go ahead of these things.
Right.
But I feel that the only area where that gets more complicated is in terms of action economy. So the idea that in a medieval Renaissance type setting, and I guess even all the way up into like modern settings, so you could go as close as like Enlightenment era stuff, most weapons can be calculated as acting in a single moment.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I think that the Western as an archetype is this perfect, weird midpoint is because guns can shoot multiple times before reloading, but the action on the gun, except in the exception of like the Gatling gun, the idea is still easy to kind of count off in your head. As soon as you move into fully automatic weapons, including even ones that exist in, say, well, maybe you could treat ones in World War I, even though they're generally mounted weapons or like tripoded weapons, as functioning a little bit differently because of that. So there's an easy way to weigh the advantage disadvantage because you can't move. But as soon as you get hand operated automatic guns, the action economy completely changes.
Yeah, like portable automatics really mess with things.
You can work them in, but I find if the rules don't carefully accommodate that, it can really break your action economy.
Yeah, I agree. Like they need to exist within a role that understands what that weapon does, as opposed to just meaning you can shoot 5 times a turn.
Yeah, also that's ridiculously tedious. You would rather treat the rapid fire, like the burst rapid fire or like the full auto function, as more like a single action that is then more abstracted and having a certain effect.
That's what I would do. Yeah.
The role-playing games that I've seen that use automatic weapons tend to want to lean into that because counting every bullet is insane, especially with the rate of fire that some guns can have.
And with the way variance works on dice rolls, it just leads to awkward jams all the time, or just everyone's head exploding from getting sniped. It's just not a good way to do it.
Yeah. It becomes really complicated. Like, I still haven't penetrated Phoenix Command, which I don't know how they handle rapid fire in that. By the way that the rules are written, I assume they calculate every single bullet.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are merciful enough to treat it more of like a probabilistic like spray. But yeah, most games that have any sense of high rates of attack or fire beyond like 3 of something tend to treat those weapons as being very different, and also them having a predominant effect on the focus of the game. So that, yeah, you might be in a modern setting and some old coot with his Kentucky rifle comes out and tries to blast you with it. But it's not the standard for the setting. It's sort of seen as the inferior exception.
Yes.
I find rule designs around things like rapid fire are built more onto what the focus of the game is, and as I said, where the action economy of the game actually exists.
In campaign play, do you think time tracking is essential, yay or nay? Like, this is thinking of a campaign turn or a campaign unit. Do you need to know how long that is? Or is that something you can also use game context to work with? Or is that like, oh no, I gotta know this?
What's the what do you mean with the context? Are you talking like in a war game situation or a role-playing game?
I think it applies to both equally, where the question is in a campaign context, so in something linking events, whether they be the events of an adventure party or a war, do you need to know how long those campaign increments are? Like in a game like At the Sharp End for Chain of Command, it doesn't really tell you what a campaign ladder step is, and it kind of suggests to you that it's very contextual based on what campaign you've assembled, wherein it could be like 50 minutes or it could be 2 days. It's like in the Western Desert, maybe it is 2 days as you're traveling by truck to get to the next oasis. But maybe in Stalingrad, it's like an hour as you catch your breath, So it's something that can be very flexible. I'm someone who wants to know how long the thing is going to take. That's what I need to know to really effectively dial in my campaign logic and my campaign writing. So do you find that as important, especially considering you're more of the RP guy?
Yeah, I do think it's important, but it really depends on what it touches on. Because I'm also more of a system guy than a narrative person. I mean, my view is that the narrative emerges out of the system. So it depends. What does time even affect? I would say that it's good to calculate, to interpret, as you say, like, oh, if I'm writing a log of what's going on and then it took this many days for us to get to the next battle.
Yes, right.
That would be useful to know. But in terms of, say, like, if it has mechanical effects, like resupply or survival mechanics, then it is more important, at least in an abstract sense. So if we progress, like, you can calculate it in different ways. I always find there's an in-game function that has a real-world analog. And what you're referring to is the real-world analog as being, and as I said, it's a nice to know, not a need to know, because all you need to understand is how many points of a sequence do you need to achieve, and then what would that calculate to the next thing. That in itself will give you interesting results. So for instance, if you're playing a campaign, like a wargame campaign, where you pressing forward stretches your supply line, if you don't hold position or, calculate a certain amount of time to let supply lines catch up, then resupply becomes more difficult. But that's not dependent on knowing exactly how long resupply and movement ahead of it would take. Or if you are measuring it in those terms, it's just in those little sequential steps. Oh, I fought 3 battles consecutively, so now I'm way ahead of my supply.
Yes, right, okay.
Right, I don't need to know how long that actually takes.
Yeah.
I can surmise. And as I said, I very much appreciate designers that include what that means so that I can figure that out. I mean, how long is a combat turn in D&D? Is it like 10 seconds, which is maybe way too long? Or is it like 3 seconds, which might be a little more accurate?
Well, isn't the rounds being 6 seconds a pop was one of the old standards, but does that still hold up?
The old standard, I think, was 10 seconds. And people had all kinds of weird justifications as to why that was. And it may have just been the arbitrariness of 10 seconds fitting into a turn taking 10 minutes. I think it was more of a congruency, probably because it was a round number.
Because I've always known the 6 second.
That's either a second edition amendment or a third editionism.
I think that's a third edition thing, but yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, some time calculations in like first edition AD&D are really weird. Same thing with the whole like squares inside a dungeon are this far and outside in the overworld are a different size. But if you don't know that, then it gets really confusing. I guess that's my answer, is that I feel that a good system that wants to make the world feel like a real place should have some should at least suggest some representation of actual time going with it. I think with role-playing games, that is much nicer because it is a more individual what happened thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as you zoom out in a battle, it becomes more abstracted. But it's also nice to have in that case as well. It adds to the fidelity of the game.
It does.
Even if it's not functional to actually do it.
And I feel like some of those things that are conveniences or accoutrement to the main dish, I find them valuable because they help me understand and contextualize things.
Mm.
So, like, if I know a campaign turn is meant to be 6 hours, like a quarter of a day, it helps me visualize what I'm doing, what I'm able to do, how far I'm going, and my mind's eye can better rationalize what the ask is as the gamer.
It makes those actions more meaningful, even if it doesn't make it any more functional.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put that.
That's generally how I think about it. So as much as I would say that it's not critical, I would much prefer having that information.
Yeah.
That's true of distance, especially in, say, strategy games where sometimes that's hand-waved. I mean, usually miniature games have some representation of this because there's a conversion of actual measurement to real-world measurement. I mean, yeah, D&D, you've got your 5 or 10 foot squares, so you can calculate it in that sense as well.
Yeah.
That's an interesting problem, or I don't know if it's a problem exactly. I mean, in the decision of what is important, but yeah, I do think that it's something that I would want.
It is something that I look for in a game, and it doesn't even have to be something that you arrive at mechanically per se, like in the Squad Hammer games by Nordic Weasel. At the end of a turn, you roll a d6, and that's how many minutes that turn was. And that's more for allowing you to add up to, say, 15 minutes to know that the game would be over because of something, or that reinforcements would arrive, or that whatever interval of time needs to pass, right? But it's just cool to me that I can retrospectively look back and be like, man, the power plant was 20 minutes to take over. That's crazy. And that just helps sell it to me. And I know that's all just jazz. That's all like superfluous stuff. But I do find that I have that connection with those moments a little more poignantly when I have that extra detail with it all, you know?
It adds more weight to the entire thing. Even if you're not thinking about it and you have to figure it out afterward,
yeah,
it still makes it go, oh, wow, that was an intense moment that took this long. And yeah, in scenarios where there is like, you know, every round counts down a timer and then something crazy happens after so many rounds. I mean, I was introduced to that idea really early on. That TSR game, Dragon Strike, the one with the awful video that's so hilarious.
Oh, yes.
That game has a dragon timer, so that it's essentially a way to get everyone's asses moving.
That's awesome.
So that if you don't complete the quest within a certain amount of time, the dragon shows up and it's actually counted down in rounds. So like, that's a way to make timing mean something.
That's super fun. Yeah, that really is. And it doesn't have to be a really complicated way to make timing matter, but it could be cool little things like, say you're doing a card-driven game like Sharp Practice. That game has an end of turn, the Tiffin card in the deck, right? When that's drawn, that ends the turn, thereby interrupting the flow of time. And then that minute, that's all that happened in that minute. But what I really like is if you draw the end of turn card as the first card, it triggers an end of chapter, and certain things are considered to happen in this time. Like if you have a water cart, everyone gets a resupply of water or ammunition, like they get to replace their shot or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really cool way to like represent a break in the action without there being a really complicated system of like, well, it's been 26 minutes, so everyone needs water now. Like, you know what I mean?
It's interjecting a beat style thing. But again, it forces that thing to happen. And that's a really cool way to do it. Yeah, the Troika initiative system does that. And it makes it really chaotic because it's, there's so many tokens in a bag and one of them just ends the turn.
Exactly. I love that.
There's a lot of ways to handle it. But yeah, the question is like, what does this thing actually represent? And that's really what we've been trying to dig into. And also, how does that meaningfully play? Because not to undercut what you're saying, there's a distinction between the timing mechanics that make the world feel more real narratively, and then there's the ones that affect decision making.
Those are different. You're right.
So if we've come to anything in this time, it is that. And that is something for all of you to think about. I'd be interested to hear what people's preferences or whether they care one way or the other or how it feels differently. Yeah, please let us know.
And for the next week, we're going to come back with a war game here. A new one from this year, a little bit earlier on, was released, Pillage by Victrix Games. Victrix Models, actually. This is their first foray into making a game, and it's a partnership with a fantastic French author. The game is extremely cool. Victrix Models are gorgeous. It's just a match made in heaven for me, so I'm very excited to talk about that in some more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been hearing a lot of chatter around it, so I'm excited to see what the business is.
As far as a historical war game goes, it is probably like the most accessible one on the market. So I think that is just such a win, and it's a really cool era. It's got such familiar mechanics, if you know what I'm saying, wink, and we'll get into that, but it's a really cool game.
All right, well, until then, everybody have a great rest of your week, and happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.